Hey, Julie, how you doing?
Oh, anyway.
Well, okay, well, there you go. That's how you're doing. And the more observant of you may have noticed we have a third person on Pandas with us, and I'm particularly excited to introduce Lois Kelly, who is, for the record, the originator of the phrase "rebels at work." We met, gosh, 13 plus years ago.
Yes.
Conference in Rhode Island, her home state, and I was talking about my experience as a heretic at CIA, and she came up to me and said this magical question: why is it that people don't help rebels at work? And that pretty much was the origin point of the whole rebels at work endeavor. And Lois is well, what more would you like to say about yourself as introducing yourself?
Um,
She's a consultant.
I worked with big Fortune 100 companies on, crisis communication, digital marketing, strategic communications. I've been a ghostwriter. So communications and creative expression
Very good.
is my thing. Yeah.
Right. And so hopefully we'll make podcasts or vlogs in the future about rebels at work as well. But we're going to talk today about a very unique experience, at least for me, unique. I guess more and more people are having it, that Lois had just a few weeks ago, where she traveled to the Netherlands, to Amsterdam, to engage in what I'm calling a psychedelic therapy. And I'm going to ask Lois to use her own words to describe it.
Sure. Well, I think psychedelic therapy is a good word because there were 7 of us I was the only American, with a group called Inward Bound, which is a group of Irish psychotherapists who specialize in psychedelics. And for me, I had 2 things going into it that I wanted to explore. And I sort of, in my meditation, a month before, my 2 questions were, may I learn from my sorrow and be transformed by it? And the second one was, may I be open to love and regain my creativity? So I had been a caregiver for my husband, had Parkinson's for many, many years, and he died in the spring. And, as my go-to is like, well, I took care of all the estate things, and I cleaned out, all his clothes, and I did all the banking things. And then I said, instead of dealing with my feelings, I will sell my house. I'll sell everything in my house. I'll move from the country into the city. And I did all of that. And I thought, who am I? I just was numb. I went to a therapist and he said, well, grief just takes a while. And, and I thought, I don't know, I was just frustrated. And I had heard from friends who are therapists about the use of psychedelics. And so I did some research into, different groups because I wanted to be with some very trained psychotherapists. And I took myself to a beautiful retreat center north of Amsterdam.
Wow.
And I am a person who, all my life, I've relied on my thinking, my rational being. So it was frightening to realize I was giving up, surrendering. And it was also comforting to know that what I was surrendering to was myself. And there were in this room, you take the mushrooms, you put, the eye shades on, you lie down in your little nest of a futon and your comforter, and a soundtrack starts to play. And for the next 6 hours, your mind is going to take you where you must go. It was the hardest thing I've done in my life. I actually think childbirth, and I had a very long labor, may have been easier. And it was probably the most, it sounds so trite. I think even Michael Pollan says this, it sounds so trite, but you say it was profound. Because we get to our essence, like who we really are. And as your ego dissolves, the ego and all that goes with the ego, status and anger and fear and revenge, like it all drops away. And I think that's the beauty of the psychedelic experience, because so you come to something very, but in dropping away my ego, I will tell you, for the first bit of my experience, I was in hell.
What do you mean? What are you talking about?
I was trapped in hell, literally. So it was very, very real to me. I was lost in alleyways. It sort of felt like Dickens' London, the rats and the alleys. And then I was still in hell, and I was in sort of Times Square in the 1970s with, the strip joints and I couldn't escape. I couldn't escape.
So the feeling was of like despair or frustration or
I was frightened. I was frightened. And I think it was probably many things, but one of it was letting go of my ego, letting it die. And I think the other part of hell was part of what I had lived through the last 4 years was I never told most people how bad it got, and letting go of that. And when I escaped hell, I ran up, I found a stairway, and I was running up the stairway, and I came to this fire door, and I went, whoa! And I came out, and then it was like this beautiful plaza, and it was light and sunny, and there was applause.
Wow.
And I just started screaming, I'm alive. I'm so happy to be alive. And that feeling has kind of rewired my brain, like how happy I am for the smallest little things. I also asked, later that night, the people who ran the program, I said, I heard applause when I got out of hell. I said, was I hearing things? And they're like, oh no, that was part of the soundtrack. So it's like a really weird thing that the soundtrack was applause. And that was my sort of freedom.
So do you think that the soundtrack is like a prompt to help you create a narrative? Because it sounds like you had a narrative going.
Yes, because I asked for the soundtrack afterwards.
Oh.
And you can see it started off really dark and kind of Game of Thrones like. And then the music, then it changed, and then there is a narrative to the music. It's very interesting in, again, these guided therapeutic experiences, that the music is a very important part of the experience, which is just sort of interesting. I've kind of gotten interested in some new music since I went through this, because I think music is, it affects us as a sense of awe and transcendence. So anyway, that was a really important part of it. And in the experience, there were three important men in my life, and, you know, they were all there. And so I had a chance to talk to them, but really interestingly.
Were they there in hell, or they were there after
No,
you
no,
came
once
out?
I got out of hell, and I wonder if hell was me subconsciously like holding on to my ego or not surrendering to the experience. Because once I got out of hell, that's when the beautiful insights came. And it was, and again, it sounds so trite to say life-changing, but it was magnificent. It was also physically, for me, really hard because I'm 68 and I probably have repressed all these emotions since I, was 2 years old. So like the sobbing and also laughing and screaming with happiness. I felt like this was a very physical experience. And at one point, one of the therapists had to help me breathe and actually wail, just let it all out.
Wow.
Nice.
So how did they prepare you for this experience?
You go through some sessions with the psychotherapist. I mean, they in the beginning, before they accept you, they look for, if you're on certain medications or family of mental illness, because they're not a hospital setting, so they're not equipped to do that kind of work. But then they really prepare you as far as setting your intention. What do you want to get out of this? So that you're very clear. And then they also, a month, like 2 or 3 weeks beforehand, no alcohol, no sugar, no caffeine, no, so like to be in the best physical shape that you can be is important. And then also to reassure you, like to, when things start happening, to just notice them, not get alarmed, but to notice what's going on in your body and just examine it, but don't be afraid by it. So the preparation was good, and it felt like a very safe place. And you could hear the therapists be with different people. And also when I was having a really hard time in these 6 hours, someone was with me. So it allowed me to just calm down and be in the experience and know it was safe. I would be okay.
And you only did this once, I'm assuming.
I only did it once. There was a next day, there was a second trip. I was so worn out from the first one. I said to the facilitators, I said, I cannot do a second day. And they said, you shouldn't do a second day. And I got out of it everything and more that I wanted. I found it fascinating to hear people I loved talking about me. And it brought me.
Do you mean during the trip or afterwards?
During the trip.
So this was your inner representation
my
of the
inner
people
self.
you love. Yeah.
And what it just said to me is, what I bring, who I am, and to be that, and to let go of all the ego-driven stuff. No one said, people loved me for a certain spirit in spiritual things.
Like the core of who you are.
Right.
But not like the service you do into the world or whatever.
No.
Yeah.
None of that.
Yeah.
And so then to me, what's interesting to me is post experience the sessions with psychotherapists to integrate what we learned, which may
And
be
did
the
they?
most
I mean, do you
important
feel
part.
like they worked? I mean, people talk about this as the biggest issue with psychedelic therapy, that they have this amazing trip and these insights, and then the integration, does it actually work, you know?
Yeah, I think it's the most important part. So as soon as the trip ended, there were art supplies and we had to draw everything we had been through. The next day, I spent 8 hours writing down everything that happened so I would never forget it. And then the following day, we had one-on-one sessions with psychotherapists. And then we had group sessions. And then we had 3 post-Amsterdam sessions with integration. So I think that's so important. And the next day you think you understand what went on, but I found it was like 3 weeks later, I really started to understand it. And I think maybe 3 weeks from now, I'll understand it even
So
more.
it's been a little more than a month. When did you
Yes.
do this? Yeah, a
Yeah,
little more
end of
than a month.
October. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Wow.
well, I'm curious, Julia, because I know you know a lot more about this and have studied it. Well, I haven't studied it at all. I did read a New Yorker article about it once, so of course I didn't study it at all. But what are your thoughts on this type of therapy and sort of what Lois has described?
Yeah, so I get trapped in these situations with my own um wanting to describe how little I know about it. How little I know about it is, however, pretty comparable to how little the most expert person knows about it. In other words, not very many people know any. In fact, I don't think anyone really understands it. But certainly there are people who understand it better than I do. And I'm not a psychoanalyst or a psychotherapist. And while I have done cognitive neuroscience, I haven't looked specifically in experimental ways at psychedelics and the brain. So there's all my caveats. Now, having read some papers, written a book related to consciousness that contained some work around psychedelics, and talked to friends who work in the field, um, what I think is that psychedelics got a really bad name from MK Ultra and other um, and related uh, unethical experiments in the 50s, 60s. Um, and but what was discovered then was actually that there is something that changes the brain about these. There's something that opens up like a portal or a um, unblocks things or rewires things, whatever words you want to use, at whatever level you want to think about it. There's definitely something that changes. It doesn't always stick. Sometimes it sticks too much and you have flashbacks when you don't want them, right? That certainly acid LSD does that, but less so, I think, for mushrooms. That's what I hear. Um, and now it's having this resurgence. I mean, so you have folks in Silicon Valley who are microdosing with acid or taking little bits of mushrooms. And um, you have people doing ayahuasca. You have people doing it with an intention that's different than before. So like the intention of healing, the intention of fulfilling whatever intention that they have, which is often a healing intention, of seeing, of transforming. Um, I like to use the word transmogrifying, of really changing something in a powerful, sort of radical way. And that, so less experiential, like I almost think of sort of the old way that people talked about psychedelics, was sort of like porn. I mean, like, let's have this experience, you know? And this feels much more like wow, there's a way to use this for something beyond self-medication, beyond just experience chasing, that's profoundly um, enmeshed in the human consciousness that we don't understand it. And people, that just because we don't understand it, and maybe because we don't understand it, doesn't mean that people, however you want to take that sentence, doesn't mean that people shouldn't use it and experiment with it if it's relatively safe for them and they feel it is. And so I guess I'm just excited because we're in a state of not knowing and uncertainty around where this is going to go, around how it influences the brain and the path forward of human consciousness and development. And um and I've been thinking lately how much our cognitive and mood uh sort of infrastructure of this country we don't think of as infrastructure. We don't think of your cognitive ability or your mood, your capacity to grow and change and develop mentally or spiritually. We don't think of that as infrastructure. That's
Mhm.
infrastructure. That's like it's in fact the infrastructure. Right? Like if
Yes,
you right? If you can hack
yes,
the brain,
yes.
right? That's a hack that can go in good ways and bad ways. And we better understand both of those. And it's really important. So to me, this ought to be really high priority.
Yeah, and there's a huge amount of research out there because, of course, and I had friends that said, "Oh, you're crazy," and so I would send them research. But I really like last summer there was on PBS a Nova episode called "Are Psychedelics the Answer?" and really looking at the research that's being done at NYU, and then John Hopkins is excellent. And then, there's much more research out there than people realize. Up at Dana-Farber, they're doing new research for people who are dying, who, through the use of psychedelics, the fear of dying goes away. And so they
Yep.
can actually enjoy what time they have left. And again, I think it's because it dissolves the ego. And
Yeah, but it could be trouble. And so that can lead to trouble, right?
well, I think this is why I actually would never do sort of recreational microdosing. And I would never do, some people say, well, you can do drop acid, you get some good friends, you're in a safe place. For me, no, this is your mind. And I think it's when there's talk about legalizing it, it makes me nervous because I can only speak from my experience. If I hadn't been in with these trained people, things could have gone very bad because it really slammed me. And I think I know people talk about bad trips, and I don't think they're prepared. I don't think they have skilled therapists. I don't think they have the integration. So I don't think it should just be sort of legalized. I think it's dangerous.
Now, did you go to Amsterdam because that's
It's
where
legal.
it's legal there? So this kind of consciousness treatment is not really, not really, is not legal in any state in the United States. Is that
I
correct?
don't believe it is.
Mushrooms are not, right?
Not
Right.
mushrooms.
Yeah.
And is it legal in Mexico? I'm only saying that because I know a lot of them are sourced.
Yeah. And
from
Costa
Mexico.
Rica, I think Costa Rica,
Okay.
there's some things going on. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think
And so I
many
think what,
many South American countries, yeah.
yeah, I think what you get,
Mhm.
which is sort of sad, that the people who went on this, journey, people have money. So the inequities are terrible. That if you have money, you can get this treatment.
And that's changing. I just want to point out. So I want to give a plug to. We talked about some East Coast places that are doing research. People don't kind of on the East Coast, I notice, even consider the West Coast because they just decide, well, of course, Californians are doing this work. Like, do we even believe them? But they just want to take acid. But we've got UCSD, Berkeley out there, a little work at
Stanford is
UCSF,
doing work.
University of Washington. So there's and then of course MAPS, which is the big psychedelic organization out there that we can also link to. But recently, a friend, Cassie Veaton at UCSD, is working with Michael Sapiro, who lives up in Idaho, but works with her on um, trying to get psychedelic therapy that's legal and that's legal because it's in a trial, or is legal because it's ketamine, which is a legal psychedelic, um, to law enforcement officers and first responders who have trauma and working on their PTSD. And so I think it's changing because it's becoming more of a psychological, as you said, Carmen, consciousness treatment.
Mhm.
But I agree that it doesn't make sense to say, like, let's just sell mushrooms at the 7-Eleven, right? There's this whole context thing that's so important until we get to a state, which we're not at, of maturity, where people sort of know this, right? We can't even do that with alcohol, right? People abuse alcohol still in contexts where it doesn't really work for them and it's destructive. So if we can't do it with alcohol, we're not gonna be able to do it with other things. But at some point, maybe we could get to a state of maturity where people just know, oh, culturally, oh, if you're gonna do mushrooms, this is how we're gonna do it. It's set and setting, and we're making, sure there's some kind of integration, and it's like a group project that we're, good people are helping you with, and I can dream for the future on that one.
Yeah, and I think I have a lot of friends who are psychotherapists who would like to be licensed and be able to do this as part of their practice, because they have too many people who are super intellectual, and they can do talk therapy, and they never, like, there's a layer that this is sort of like a jackhammer. It blows it open, and then you can do the real work.
Right.
And I think that would be an important first step, is to have psychotherapists already who have, doctorates or medical degrees, then have additional training, and that's how we do it.
And that's being done, right? So
Well,
that's
not widely. No, it's in very limited settings.
well, okay, maybe I'm speaking from the West Coast, but on the West Coast it's happening.
Okay.
I'm reminded, Julia, of you're talking about how, Lois, how you have to crack through this thing of layer of rationality. And that reminded me of the conversation we had with Julia's mom a few weeks ago, who is a psychotherapist. And we were talking about how when there's a rupture in the relationship between a psychotherapist and the patient, that can actually be a very powerful breakthrough moment, because the rupture, the explosion, the off-script conversation can lead people to actually confront more important fundamental issues. So I was just thinking about that.
Oh, that reminds me of your being in hell and then,
Yes, and
coming up
out.
on the rooftop,
Yeah. I mean, but for me, it was, I'm always in control, I've always been in control, and I'm like the problem solver, and I like that. But I realized that I can actually be a better version of myself without being in control.
Okay, wait, this brings up a super important point that is near and dear to my heart that I want to ask you about. You had said maybe you hadn't felt some of these feelings since you were 2 years old. And what was interesting to me about that choice, I mean, I don't know if that was personally you remember something that happened when you were 2. My guess is you didn't, but did you personally remember? Yeah.
No.
Yeah. 2 is when the ego happens.
Oh.
People talk about the terrible twos.
Yes.
It's because until then, the kid is like, oh, I'm sad, cry, cry. Oh, there's a sparkly thing, pretty, stare. Oh, I'm hungry, wah, eat. I mean, just like completely at the mercy of the experiences that are washing over the kid, right? And then at 2, there's this self that forms that says, I want that. There's an I. Before 2, kids often say things like, if it was me, I would say, Julia, Julia hungry or something, right? I'm not even saying I, right? It's just like there's this Julia concept and apparently she's hungry. But at 2, it's like, I want that. I give it to me. I want it. Or no, not that. There's this assertion of the I am different from you. And it's where the ego comes from, which we need, I mean, to survive. And then you see at the end of someone's life, and I'm only bringing this up because my mom and my stepmom are at the hospital right now dealing with difficult stuff around my stepmom's brain. And you see the ego starting to wash away naturally, of just maybe it's harder to say I and you. Maybe it's easier to just name people. Maybe there's not as much of a desire of what I want. I'm blank on that, but there I can feel love. So I say things like love, just like that's the thing that washed over me was love, you know. So this anyway, so this is a long way of saying, do you think that when you said 2 years old, was that about this egoic flip that is about control? Like there's an I, and I have the desire to feel like I have control. Do you feel like that was what flipped, or am I making this up?
No, I think it's, I don't know about 2 years old. I grew up in a chaotic household with too many kids, and but I think the ego, it helps us. To your point, we need the ego, but then I think it controls us, or it can, and then it gets all out of whack. So that to me is like really interesting. It's like, how do you know the ego isn't aligned with, I don't know what you want to call it, your soul or your essence, but to me, there has to be some balance. I think I view the ego as like the devil in hell, just like wanting to, like, this creature control you.
Wow.
And not for your best interests, really.
No, right. For its own theory and fantasy about what the best interests are. Yeah.
Yes. And, when the group I was in, it was really interesting people from all ages, all over the world. And we decided that we knew, like, the best way how to solve the world is to take all these powerful egomaniac, status-seeking, power-hungry people and have them go on a psychedelic trip so they could feel sort of, for that to dissolve and feel kind of the love. I mean, that's what we all felt, is love. And even afterwards, in one of our integration calls, was one woman, and she was in the group. She thought she was going to leave her husband, but something happened onto the trip. And she said, well, I'm still with my husband and we don't fight anymore, but we have conversations. And she said, the difference is I have the conversations from a point of view of love.
Mm-hmm.
How do I approach this with love? And she said, it has changed the conversation. It has changed the relationship. And I think of so many interactions in our life, if we came from a perspective of love,
Exactly.
the outcomes are so different.
Right.
I'm on some kind of list, conversation list with a bunch of people who are sort of in like defense and diplomacy and public policy. And recently it came up, someone said, it's just really hard. And I was like, yeah, we really need more love. And people are like, yeah, we really do need more love. How do we do that?
Mm-hmm.
And it got into this conversation of control, like treating love. Someone said, well, it's just compassion. So we just need to be more compassionate. Like it's a character trait that you can build. And so you just need to do more compassionate things, and then you're going to be more loving. And I was just like, that's how you get into trouble. That's not actually the same thing. Like, because that's the old way of saying, oh, I know. I'll just put it on my list of things to do. And I am a problem solver and I'm going to be more compassionate. And then it's like, it's the opposite. And it's what people who are super functional and who are problem solvers and who are always in control aren't used to doing, which is receiving what's already there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the other thing since I've been on this journey is think to become more compassionate is tuning into different voices. I'm sort of become a girl fan of Nick Cave since I got back. And he, his son died a few years back at 15. and it broke he and his wife apart. I mean, they were a couple, but just the grief. And he's written a book about it. He has a blog, called the Red Hand Files, where people write him questions, and most of them about suffering. And then he responds, and I feel like my arms tingling. He's such a beautiful and compassionate and vulnerable person. And then he wrote an album called Ghost Teen, Gosteen. And it's a very, I have this, I play this on repeat. And I've started to talk to people. I'm like, Nick Cave. And then people start talking about Nick Cave stories. And then they start to talk about vulnerability and what it means to be compassionate. But for me, sometimes the way into being compassionate, again, it's not here. It's through his music. I put it on and I melt into a better version of myself. Mm. So sometimes I think when we talk about all kinds of things, again, it's like, what are the 5 things I can do to be more compassionate? We're like, because we're up here. And we have to experience feelings. And we have to show up messy ourselves. We have to talk about what we're afraid of, like what we're really afraid of. And not to have any expectations of the conversation, but just, just bring our messiness and show up to just listen to other people. I mean, like really listen. Or I had a friend going through a hard thing, and I just like held her hand. Like there were no words.
Right.
It's just.
Well, this makes me want to each of us talk about what we're really afraid of. Are we up for that?
Sure.
I mean, I'm craving that conversation, actually.
So what are you afraid of?
What am I really afraid of? What am I really afraid of? Just being alone. And by being alone, I don't mean physically alone. I mean, by not being able to be with anyone who can be authentically with me. So feeling alone is what I mean.
Carmen, what about you?
Well, I think classically, I'm afraid of death. I had a very strong experience when I kind of realized how life ended in death. And that was, I don't know, 12 maybe, something like that. And then it took me a long time to sort it out to where I'm comfortable, increasingly so, but that remains a fear. I don't fear being alone. I don't. It's funny. I mean, it would take too long to explore all of this, but I don't feel. I mean, so I do feel, Julia, that nobody knows me intimately. No one knows me as well as I know myself. And I've never had the relationship where someone could know me intimately. But I'm not particularly troubled by that, or at least I tell myself I'm not. And I don't have any outward symptoms of being troubled by it. And, you can judge. Others will judge that better than I. But I do. And I guess I do worry for the human race. a lot. That's a kind of a more abstract fear, but I am heartened by the fact that everybody that travels into the future, 2,000-3,000 years, comes back and reports that we're still around. I haven't come across anybody yet who says, "Oh, there was nothing there," you know? So that's good news. How about you, Lois?
Afraid of, I feel like I'm living in this liminal space right now. And I'm afraid of being here too long. I feel like I feel lost and be, because I always had like my work and my husband and my home and in traditions, and it's sort of all blown up. And I say, well, something else will emerge. And I'm worried it won't. I'm afraid it won't. Then, like, I don't know. I don't know. It's this weird space of not knowing what to do with myself, but I don't want to fall back and do things that I know how to do or were easy, because they don't really interest me. I don't feel like I'm learning. And I want to be stretched and I want to learn. And I'm afraid I could fall back and do the easy things to feed my ego. No, so I'm just worried. Like, am I in this orbit, and could I just be in this void? And I don't. It's very uncomfortable.
Well, it reminds me of you talking about the discomfort you had during your trip. Like, you were asking yourself to do this thing and stay in this state, and it was uncomfortable. And now you're kind of on a longer term asking yourself to do that.
Yeah, I think it's letting it's. I know, or I believe, it's a place of learning. And I just, I like to get things. I like to get on with it.
Let's learn something.
Right. I'm also, Julia, back to your other point, I'm hearing from a lot of people this sort of desire to have meaningful conversations, like just a yearning.
Yes.
Just a yearning. And how do we come together for a dinner, but to have a really good question,
Right.
and I think and I don't even know where you go to do all of this. I mean, what I loved as much as the psychedelic trip, what I liked even more is spending 5 days with really interesting people who were sharing what's meaningful in life and what their fears are, and what their struggles are, and what their failures were, and just that, and this safe space to have really interesting conversations, and what you learn, just what you can learn from people when you go
Right.
deep. And I can't stand, like, I really try sometimes with like LinkedIn or social media, and it's like giving me a headache. It just seems so superficial, and it's not. I mean, I know how you use it and you can get there, but it's almost like, where can you go? It's almost like for a weekly feast of connectedness.
Right. No,
It's the connection. It's the connection.
I get that completely. And I always, was very envious when you read 19th century novels like Tolstoy or the French novelists. There's always usually a woman, interestingly enough, in that town that hosts the best salon in Moscow or St. Petersburg or
you've got
Paris.
this Simone de Beauvoir.
Yeah, and she brings all the people together, and people know if they get an invite, they can go there for really good conversation. Now, if you're really unpack that, there's a lot of, dick swinging and ego stuff going on
Yeah.
there, right? But I don't know. Is there a female equivalent of dick swinging? I am
Yeah, it's putting each other down.
Yes. Oh, well, you know what I think is a bit of the female equivalent of dick swinging is the female gaze, by which, yeah, two women see each other and they look at each other to see how they look. I don't know if you've noticed that. I notice it. I do it. Everybody does it. I try to avoid doing it, but they'll look at you and it's like the inspection look. And I find that an annoying quality of our gender, actually.
Yeah, I think that we are so trained to look at the outside that we have trained away our natural inclination, and by we I mean like humans have trained away our natural inclination to actually look at someone's sort of energy.
Yes, exactly. Right.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a great conversation, and I'm just aware that we're up to the 1 hour mark. I wanna say one thing that you said, Lois, when you said that unfortunately this is an activity for people with money. And I was reminded, and I want to say it because it is the holiday season, and everyone is commenting on, all the different usually Christmas commercials on TV. Chevrolet has a very affecting one, and there's a nice one for Amazon on the women who go sledding down the hill. And what makes me sad about those commercials, these Christmas season commercials, is they're all about rich people Christmases. And I'm actually quoting someone who pointed that out on Facebook. That's not my original observation, and Gouch is the person's name. So I it's a non sequitur, but I just wanted to say that I think, we try to mask the consumerism associated with the holidays, but even when we try to bring up these feelings of great affection and connection, it's still for people with means. And so I don't have a solution to the comment I just made, but I wanted to share that.
And I think with the connection, I think it's just calling people.
Yes.
It's just picking up the phone for people you haven't seen or talked with, or who might be lonely, and just picking up the phone, And I did that today. I have an aunt, and her grandson, it was a tragic death of a 34-year-old last week. And she was just so grateful to talk.
Right.
And I'm like, all day long, I was like, oh, I don't want to make this phone call, but
yeah.
If we can just pick up the phone. Or there was a policeman in front of my building, there was stuff happening, and I said, boy, last night was rough in the city. And he just talked, like if we can just do those small listening, especially during the holiday season.
Exactly.
Well, if we can. And so I feel like everyone puts a lot of pressure on themselves. And to this point of wealthy people and those commercials, also, I mean, both of my parents here are therapists, and they see all wealthy people who can afford to pay for their therapy because they don't take insurance. And these are the most disconnected, loneliest people. Like when they do work in hospitals or places where there's people who are less well off, they're like, oh, their problem isn't like loneliness and disconnection in general. I mean, there's something that has to do with the wealthy culture that says like, yeah, you're supposed to be separate and distant. And that doesn't serve wealthy people very well.
Yeah.
So there's that too.
Yeah. And life is much more fun when you're just
right.
When you're just wherever, talking to whomever.
Exactly.
And you're not afraid of it.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, Lois, thank you so much for
Well,
joining
thank you. It was
us.
so nice to talk with both of you. I have so much fun listening to your podcast.
Oh,
I
thank
love
you.
it's just I love that it's just sort of people and topics that you find interesting, and then it goes where it goes.
And we didn't talk about it before, Julia, but we're not going to end with our dancing because we haven't organized it yet.
Well,
But
hold on. Now you say that all the time, and I'm pushing you. So our guest mentioned Nick Cave.
oh,
Now, so is there some Nick Cave song that we could dance to that you think would be really good?
Um, well, no, Nick Cave is not dancing music.
Right. Well, I don't know. I mean, I've heard Nick Cave music, and I think you can do some really
Well,
good stuff.
maybe, yes. Very
See?
good point. Yes.
So, do you think you would be interested in doing some dancing where we turn
Sure.
off the volume and
Sure.
we groove
Sure.
around?
Yes.
See, Carmen? Okay. What song do you vote for?
Maybe the spinning song. Well, the spinning song, I think it's the first song on Ghost Teen.
Okay.
It's just magical and mesmerizing.
here. I'm trying to. As we close by watching Lois and Julia actively meditate to the song Spinning by Nick Cave, we ask you if you enjoyed this, and first, thank you for listening until the end. If you enjoyed it, please do hit the subscribe button and like it, and then you'll get notified the next time we do another Pandas Playing Cello.